Hello, everyone. My name is Claudia Tomateo. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. I'm a detribalized indigenous woman descendant of the Quechua Chanca people in so-called Peru, in the region of Apurimac. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. I want to start by acknowledging that the lands which Columbia University occupies are the traditional ancestral territories of the Mohican, Wapingur, Munsee Lenape, and Shakitoke people. I acknowledge the histories of dispossession, forced occupation, genocide, and the ongoing colonial processes in which these and other settler-colonial institutions are implicated. As we honor the indigenous peoples connected to these lands, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, whose work deals with lands that have always moved. Lands holding in their fragments their history of Mother Earth. Lands seemingly far, yet existent in relationality with multiple territories and with us. Susan Schuppli is a UK-based researcher and artist. Her work focuses on examining material evidence related to war, conflict, environmental disasters, and climate change. In her latest film, Moving Ice, Schuppli first illustrates the transhemispheric movements of ice driven by colonial and capitalist forces. In doing so, she guides the audience through the strategies employed by American and European ice merchants to support plantation economies and the spice trade. The film's narrative takes us from vast glacier landscapes, drone footage and maps, to ice cubes in a glass and domestic frames, illustrating the complex and multiscleral dynamics of those movements. Secondly, Schuppli highlights local-scale ice movements driven by indigenous techniques for ice production, conservation, and storage in Iran, Syria, and Peru. Through the film, the artist displays movements from contrasting yet not isolated worldviews. On one hand, there is the view of nature as wild, agentless entity from which humans should extract resources because it will replenish infinitely. On the other hand, there is a worldview that sees bodies and territories as one indivisible whole, constantly changing and in conversation with one another. Moving Ice not only provides a perspective to understand Earth through its ever-changing nature and cyclical processes, but also enriches this understanding with otherworldly atmospheric sounds, adding another dimension to our perception of space. Schuppli's other recent work includes research on cryospheric geographies in Svalbard, climatic sense of justice, the role of ice cores as repositories of data, and the weaponization of temperature to harm racialized bodies. Her work has been showcased across Europe, Asia, Canada, and the US. She has extensively published in media and politics and authored the book Material Witness, released by MIT Press in 2020. Schuppli is professor and director of the Center for Research Architecture, Goldsmiths University of London, where she's also an affiliate artist researcher and board chair of forensic architecture. Previously, she was senior research fellow and project coordinator of forensic architecture. Prior to working in the UK, she was an associate professor in visual media arts in Canada. Schuppli received her PhD from Goldsmiths, and she's the recipient of the 2016 ICP Infinity Award. Please join me in welcoming Susan Schuppli.
Great, thank you so much, Claudia, for those lovely words of introduction. It's greatly appreciated, and it's always, it's always really important for me to, in some way, to learn about the ways in which the work and the projects that I've been embarking on, how they resonate for others, and what kinds of other kinds of perspectives they might sort of elicit. Thank you also to Andres for the invitation to join, and Shashi for all of your logistical assistance. It's like a fantastic team here, and I have to say publicly too, I think it's really important, and one of the reasons that I continue to accept the invitation was that a space like this is still open and holds a space for political discussions to happen, which is absolutely essential, especially within contexts of higher learning. So that was really key as well in terms of joining today. What I'd like to do in the time that I have is to move through sort of a cluster of ideas, and I wanted to begin with two really important moments in this kind of in the sort of trajectory of all of these projects that fall under the research sort of framework of learning from ice. The first here is a petition, as it says on the screen, that was filed on behalf of 63 Inuit community members in the Canadian High Arctic by Sheila White-Cloutier. And this was a petition that was ultimately denied because the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights at the time, this is not so long ago, 15 years ago, no, actually almost 20, in the sort of in their response, they argued that there wasn't really an intrinsic argument to be made about the relationship between fossil fuel extraction, environmental violence, and the rights of indigenous communities. But in the public imagination, this petition became known as the right to be cold. And this has always been a very powerful and provocative political kind of claim that is always there in some way in the back of my mind as I work on my way through different sort of contexts, work on different projects with different communities. Another thing that is quite, I think, significant to note is this clause from the United Nations Conventions of the Law of the Sea, which is known as UNCLOS, and of the entire body of hundreds of articles, there is one paragraph that actually recognizes that water exists in a frozen state. And I was quite sort of, in some way, shocked, but also one can really understand the ways in which a certain legacy of a colonial imagination has organized the partitioning of the world between territories that are, like have stable sort of material realities, and other spaces, the liquid spaces of oceans, seas, etc., that are organized by a more, say, fluid and dynamic set of kind of properties. And something like ice that is a kind of moves between phase states and is in a state of constant and dynamic flux really troubles this kind of partitioning of the world. So I wanted to begin by holding these two sort of let's call them frameworks in mind as we move through some of the kind of projects. So just to say that the three projects that I shared were Moving Ice, as Claudia has already mentioned, which really starts to look at the commodification of mountain glaciers and ice from lakes, etc., how that starts to enter into a 19th century kind of trade. Another film that I shared, which was actually comes from footage that I shot working on a community-based satellite project, but while I was there, I was shooting a lot of the kind of techno infrastructures that populate the Svalbard Arctic archipelago, and really trying to look at the relationship between its histories of coal mining, so this sort of like dirty extractivist history of coal, and now the sort of contemporary mediatic landscape where the entire archipelago has really become kind of encrusted with these techno-scientific kinds of like instruments, and it's the world's most northerly ground station at Svalbard, and that's what we're seeing here. I just wanted to signal these through the three videos that I shared in case there's people here who haven't necessarily seen them or engaged with them, so you know in some way what the conversation that will eventually evolve, what that might actually refract. And I also shared a video called Cold Rights, and it's a video that I consider to be a footnote, if you will, to a series of cold cases, and I'm going to start elaborating on some of these now. Specifically, cases of human rights violations that have taken place in this specific case, within North America, but the image that I just showed you was an image of migrants moving across the European border between Italy and France. And there's many, many incidences where contemporary forced migration is resulting in all kinds of harms, but including hypothermia. With forensic architecture, we embarked on investigating 3 cases in which cold was weaponized as an instrument of policing. They take place in Canada and the US, but the point with developing this cold case files was really to look at a kind of pattern of abusing, a pattern in which ambient environmental conditions were in some way utilized as a tacit and sometimes explicit form of policing and management of bodies, and bodies were largely of racialized peoples. So this is probably the case that would be the most familiar with the audience here, which is what's sort of the vernacular term is icebox detention. So the temporary holding facilities run by Customs and Border Protection along the US-Mexico border. And with forensic architecture, what we tried to do was to really map the heat signatures and the interaction of different temperature regimes within one of these holding cells. I wouldn't say that we were particularly kind of successful in doing so because there was a lot of information that we couldn't get our hands on. But what we were working with one of the few images that had been released through a kind of through a class action lawsuit. And one of the judges on the case released these images that were taken by a CCTV camera. So using a sort of minimal amount of information, we tried to create an architectural model. But of course, as anybody would know, that the experiences of temperature are extremely individuated. Depends on your gender, your age, your health conditions, etc. So the way a body experiences and interacts with temperature is widely variable, which in some way I'm not sure if that is why, but temperature is also one of the areas that is not really subject to much sort of legal oversight and jurisdiction. In the American case, I was talking to some human rights lawyers and asking them, like, what are cases in which temperature has played an operative role and where temperature was seen to be a direct kind of instrument that was used instrumentally as a form of violence or a form of like control and management of bodies. And they were saying, well, really within the American legal landscape, it's really been only in relationship to things like torture. So there were actual legal judgments written with the use of, say, waterboarding. And maybe the only other case kinds of cases would be if there was a carjacking in the middle of winter and a baby might be, had been left in the back seat and a baby perished because of extreme cold. That is the sort of moments where temperature has entered into kind of legal proceedings, but it's a very sort of gray area in terms of both it's very hard to prove that somebody used environmental conditions deliberately to inflict harm. How do you actually prove that? It's very hard thus to then produce any sort of frameworks of accountability. Here's a couple of witness statements from that then became part of the case file, and using some of this sort of information in these witness sort of statements to help us try and sort of think about ways of sort of modeling this case. But in contradistinction to the icebox detention, when we worked on the case Weaponizing Water, which was a case that took place in 2016 during the No Dapple movement, there was lots of social media images and information and public testimonies, etc. So like accessing information that is required to, say, produce a model was relatively easy to come by. So there's a very different, let's say, a visual sort of regime that was operating in which, you know, that I could tap into alongside members of the team, the FA team. And for those of you who may not know, but know this specific incident, it took place on November 18th, and the Morton County Sheriff issued what they call a cold weather warning. They could see that the weather conditions were getting poorer and poorer. They issued a cold weather warning to all of the protesters at the camp. And in issuing the warning, they actually make very clear that exposure to North Dakota's winter weather presents a very real risk of frostbite, hypothermia, life-threatening conditions. They released the cold weather warning, but went ahead with a 12-hour assault against water protectors nonetheless. So one can say, well, it would be very hard to argue that you didn't know the potential consequences of the actions that you were taking. Once again, the response on the part of the authorities were, A, we didn't realize it was going to get so cold, and B, the water that was coming out of the water hoses that we're using wasn't so cold. But the point is, in sub-zero temperatures, if anybody gets wet and if your clothing is completely soaked, then you're going to succumb to very adverse temperature effects, and this is exactly what happened. Over 300 people were afflicted with hypothermia that night. And with forensic architecture, we were then able to model, and in the videos, you can watch them all online, but in the videos, you can really see that the ways in which people were kettled in, and that the water, we were able to sort of find 76 incidents where the water hoses were deliberately and directly fired at people, rather than the authorities saying they were just used to put out sort of campfires that presented a sort of risk. The final case in these cold cases is in some way quite different. It takes place in Canada, and I have to say, sadly, it is a practice that still continues to this day, and that is this practice of taking somebody on quote-unquote a starlight tour. What that means is police, largely in the prairie provinces of Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, but there's also cases in Quebec and in British Columbia, where I'm from. Police would take usually First Nations men into their police cars at night, drive them to the outskirts of town, push them out of the car and force them to walk back in cold nighttime temperatures. Many, many people died, and this is one of the most infamous cases, is the death of a young teenager, Neil Stonechild, was left to die when he's 17 years old. This case took more than almost 2 decades to move through various commissions and royal inquiries in Canada. But with forensic architecture, the one thing that we didn't have to work on a case like this, of course, there was a complete void in terms of visual information, and nor would it have been appropriate to use any or work with any of the materials in the autopsy report. So we really worked with mapping temperature gradients. So I was able to acquire like historic temperature data from Environment Canada, and then like the map from the time of pickup, which was usually known, and then where the body was found. So a person would be found, face down, lying in the snow, frozen to death, and then how do you prove that that person was willfully abandoned by the authorities who have a duty of care? In fact, the practice came to light through a few cases of survivors. But as I said, the practice has continued. I was a reporter from the CBC contacted me last year to say an Indigenous man had come forward and said that he had been picked up by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and dropped off and made to walk back in like chilling nighttime temperatures. And did I think that this was an example of a starlight tour? Well, of course it is. But with the freezing deaths case, what we have are a very clandestine practice in Canadian policing, where the police are using the fact that temperatures plummet as a way to, as part of their kind of arsenal of tools of policing. And what was really important, as I said, with these cases, and in particular with the freezing death cases, and showing these cases in Canada, in Toronto, was to say that this history of the instrumental use of temperature for the production of harm needs to be understood as a kind of pattern of abuses that's happening and continues in all kinds of geographies and landscapes around the world, not just in cold contexts, as we see in the case of the Hilleras along the US-Mexico border, but to really situate that within a kind of pattern, because the response on the part of authorities oftentimes will be, oh, well, that was just a few bad apples and we've taken care of that problem. No, it's to say that we have to demonstrate a kind of pattern of abuse in relationship to, in this case, cold temperature. But these insights around temperature and the ways in which temperature gets mobilized really came out, and I'll need you to drop the lights for this, because I'm going to show a video clip. Actually came out of the work that I was doing in the Canadian Ice Core Archive, and in producing, no, you can keep them down, that's fine, I'm just going to play it. In producing this documentary, of course, I also had to ask myself, what is enabling this, what is enabling the life of these ice cores to exist in this lab, in this state of deep freeze? Of course, it's the production of artificial kind of cold. And so when I was working on this documentary, was also the moment that I really started to think about the production of cold as a technology. But I will play the clip and take us into the Canadian Ice Core Archive now.
The Canadian Ice Core Archive, now at the University of Alberta, shelters this unique collection of historic ice. Cores from Mount Logan in the Yukon, as well as from the Arctic archipelago, including the Penny Ice Cap on Baffin Island, the Prince of Wales Ice Field and Agassiz Ice Cap both on Ellesmere Island, and the Devon Ice Cap on Devon Island are all preserved within these cylindrical tubes.
And another clip from the same project or same film. So, as I said, those two clips were from this documentary called Ice Cores, obviously. And what I'm holding in my hand here is a chunk of ice that's about 30,000 years old. And inside that ice, we can see tiny little bubbles of air. And what we have is the atmospheric chemistry from 30,000 years ago trapped in ice. And this is why, within the world of climate science, and in particular to build the global climate model, ice cores provide the highest resolution data set that exists in terms of what I call Earth evidence. So I understand that some of you went to see a sediment core archive the other day that is managed by Columbia University. So sediment cores go much further back in time, that is to say lake bed and ocean sediments, but they have a very poor resolution. In an ice core, every layer of snowfall becomes a data layer. So you imagine in the Antarctic regions or in the in the poles, it snows hundreds and hundreds of times every year. So you've got hundreds of data points for a single season, which is really incredible when you're doing climate modeling and climate kind of projections. So, and that is because what we have in those tiny little bubbles are compressed molecules of gas, and so one can start to see, is methane on the rise, is CO2 on the rise? You can see how greenhouse gas emissions have dramatically increased post-industrialization. And so we have the actual atmospheric remainder of another time archived in ice. But as I've said throughout the work that I've been doing, and especially in relationship to ice cores, and I'm now trying to really think about, I'm writing a kind of book chapter on the ice core sort of research and my reflections on ice cores, and I just wanted to make the point that an ice core is not a natural entity, but an intensively mediated object of epistemic inquiry that has been industrially extracted from the ground, transported by a set of complex logistical operations to archives and labs around the world, where it is stored in artificially cooled environments, which are themselves reliant upon the kinds of energy infrastructures that are at the heart of indictments concerning human-induced climate change. So its multiple mediations, I would argue, are the enabling conditions for generating its epistemic insights and asserting its political relevance. This is just to say that when we're dealing with this sort of this volumetric cylinders of ice, is to really understand these. Yes, they come out of the so-called natural world, but they're highly kind of, not only are they highly kind of technical objects, they also undergo very quickly a whole set of transformations on their way to becoming part of policy frameworks. So as soon as an ice core, is transported to a lab, samples will be cut up, it'll be marked off, samples will be sent. Any scientist who needs a chunk of ice from a particular time period can request a sample, and it will be sent if there's a legitimately sound scientific rationale for needing a particular chunk of ice. I can say a lot more about like the different ways in which ice core data has been utilized from scientists, but also economists that are now using some of the data that is like the big data of ice, if you will. But so ice cores, these are the field notes of Edward Brooke, who was working in Antarctica. So we have also we have the mediation through the practice of field work and note-taking and in-situ observations. Ice very quickly, once it enters into the archive and then makes its way into the lab, very quickly it will be destroyed in order to get the air out. So, it starts to recede from view very quickly. At the same time, the kind of data that is extracted from the chemistry of ice is also then correlated with the findings of remote sensing platforms, and there's now sort of 4 dedicated, well 3 and 1 on its way, 3 plus the Crystal mission will be 4 dedicated ice sensing satellite kind of platforms. So the data that is acquired from the satellite platforms, of course, has to be ground truth by the field findings of scientists. And then all of that information gets aggregated. Eventually, it will make its way to something like this was the IPCC, session in March of 2023 that took place in Interlaken in Switzerland, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So these are the kinds of policy forums where environmental evidence and reports are disputed. I just found this image so kind of strangely compelling because it looks like such a bizarrely staged sort of image where everyone's huddled around their various sort of laptops, and honestly I don't know what it is that they're discussing or disputing, but in actual fact that material that we find in the field and work through eventually ends up in these kinds of spaces where it's worked on, discussed, etc., and then the ice core or the ice sheets of Antarctica, Greenland, and the Arctic, and the glaciers from around the world. All of that environmental research will make its way into these kinds of reports. So for me, it's become really important to try and track these transformations. But what they've done is they've also produced a kind of in some way a predicament where this sort of like what we start to also see is the ways in which local communities who might live in the context where a lot of this research is coming out of aren't really actively involved in any of these kinds of forums, the way that decisions are made, or intergenerational knowledge for etc. isn't really considered part of the world of ice core science. I have a couple of years ago, I released this vinyl LP with various field recordings that I had made at different glacier sites, but also one that was given to me by Martin Sharp. And Martin Sharp is a glaciologist who worked in the Canadian High Arctic. And he, when he was doing his research here at the Devon ice cap, he placed a small handheld recorder into one of the sort of crevices, because Martin, as a glaciologist and someone whose scientific articles go to places like the IPCC, he wanted to, he decided, I don't think at the time he made the recording, but he was just sort of overwhelmed with the sort of transformations that were taking place at the Belcher glaciers and the kind of like acoustic emissions, like the acoustic, the changing acoustic environment that was part of the changes that he could see and sense and observe and measure as a glaciologist, he could also start to hear. And so he produced a recording. I'll play a little bit of it. Or yeah, he made a recording, the producer. He made a recording, and he started to, just go back, if I can. Oops. Yeah, Martin made this recording, and he played it at one of the IPCC forums because he felt like somehow he wanted to intervene into this sort of policy forums where all of the places in which he worked as a glaciologist were only sort of engaged with as graphs and as data sets, and he somehow wanted to convey the urgency and the immediacy of what is going on in the places where those techno-scientific discussions actually have stakes, because policymakers will then ultimately act on some of these, or we would actually hope that they would act on some of these findings. So he wanted to intervene, and his intervention was through acoustics, because he felt that somehow sound would in some way collapse this kind of the distance that was keeping these different sort of realms of experience sort of apart. And I think you could see or hear, in fact, in the ice core clips that I showed, the importance of sound in trying to convey the sense that something else is going on. And that not only that ice is not simply this sort of mute witness, or in the case of an ice core, this isn't a silent sort of like artifact. I wanted to somehow, for the viewer of the film, to really convey the sense that ice was very lively and that this was a kind of living witness, in fact. And so with the moving ice film that many of you saw the other night, we really see the importance that sound plays in that film, to both denaturalize some of the images, but also to act as to bring us into another conceptual space. So at one point I'm talking about pollution in the Hudson River, but we're actually in Delhi at the time. So I was also filming in India, looking for proxies, image proxies that could help me tell the story. But I've tried to use sound very kind of experimentally at times to sort of push back at what might be seen as a kind of more sort of nature documentary sort of, let's say, visual language in some of my projects. So sound has to really do important conceptual work to, what I say, to denaturalize those images, in fact. But I wanted to, I think I'm right on time. Do I have 10 minutes left? Or 5? Okay. Yeah, because I'm really just going to focus on one last project, which will be the Listening to Ice. But this is a quote by Mark Carney, who did an ethnography, who's working in the Andes, and I'll read it out, because I think it's really quite useful. So he writes, "Yet surprisingly, most research on melting glaciers and research on global warming and climate change more broadly focuses primarily on scientific processes and the physical environment rather than people. Scientists often study glaciers to predict future climate or to decipher the effects of carbon dioxide and other emissions on climate change. They analyze ice cores and other proxy evidence, such as tree rings, to understand climate change over hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers then feed data into complex computer-driven mathematical models to predict future climate. People are often unaccounted for in this research, or they are included only in broad scenarios that plot that plot polluters against victims of the developed countries' climate-altering emissions. And yeah, I think he's absolutely kind of right. And this is in some way one of, I think, a really kind of also an important, in some way, role that I think architects, artists, creative practitioners can also, I think, play a really kind of important role in terms of like also consider the ways in which we might mediate between different kinds of disciplines and different kinds of sort of practices, all of which have their own, in some way, different forms of expertise, different sort of protocols, different sort of proprietary kind of knowledges, if you will. So this is certainly, at least for me, has been a sort of is an important aspect of the work that I've been like the work really going kind of forwards. And so maybe a couple years ago, I spent quite a bit of my time working in India, which is where most of my collaborators that I work with, we've been working together on a whole range of different projects, including a project I haven't talked about at all on Gondwana, which deals with India's research stations in Antarctica and the difficulty that India had in becoming a treaty signatory to Antarctica, being accepted. So the countries the 6 nations that controlled who had research access to Antarctica, which is still you know, it has a mandate to produce scientific knowledge that's open source. Nonetheless, the history of Antarctica is very much a kind of geopolitical history that has a lot of the same kind of neo-colonial kind of like attributes in terms of who exactly gets to participate in that research community. So the projects I've done with collaborators in India have had a range of different sort of like outputs and subject interests. But in particular, this is a project, Listening to Ice, that was done in the context of COP26, whatever people might, whatever your position on that kind of forum is. And it was Farouk Azam and I were, he's a glaciologist who's been working throughout Ladakh, and we were working at Drangdrung Glacier, and one of the things that we were doing was using the sound trap, which is it's a long-term acoustic recorder. It can do continuous recording for 6 months, 24/7. And we were trying to use, which is something that's quite a nascent technology in glaciology, is the use of acoustics to monitor glacial dynamics. And so this was something in some way that I could bring as an artist and someone who has this long-standing set of interests in sound, was bring this to the more, let's say, conventional field work that a scientist like Farouk was working with, which would be setting up a meteorological station, putting like stakes into the ablation zone of the glacier to see how much they moved every year. So we were doing a lot of, we called the project Listening to Ice, and we're using listening as a really important way to generate relations between the glacier, the scientific community, but really importantly, the mountain villagers who live in direct proximity to the glacier and whose very lives are completely reliant on the glacier as a source of water. So glacial recession, of course, in the Himalayas is very different to what's happening, for example, in Europe or in North America. We're talking about glaciers that are the primary source of water for millions of people. So water scarcity and water management and also what's called flood burst events are really some of the kind of key challenges that glacial retreat is bringing about. But in working with in Drangdrung, at Drangdrung Glacier with a local grassroots organization called Local Futures from Leh Ladakh, who are also there. What we are really trying to do is see whether there's ways that we could interact with local mountain communities to provide some sense of of what was at stake scientifically in the work. So because we were using acoustics as a research methodology, to use and work with acoustics also in terms of like community work. So it wasn't the sort of classic model of the scientist goes to a field site and perhaps talks to locals about what they're doing and why it's important, was to see like how could this site and space of science somehow be opened up and produce sort of more conditions of, say, perhaps hospitality. And so I'll play a little clip. I'll play a clip from this project as well. So if we could just dim the lights, and then I will wrap up in the next couple of slides.
네네네네. 서로라. 아동씨. 좋아라. 제가 지금 어디 비비지 깜짝만 비비지 잡아. Yeah. It's good. Yeah, it's good. Azura, zera. Mera. Masu sura. Kangsa sura mera. Nanti ini. It's like hovering helicopter. Mera. Lewat mera. Uju awak cuci tu payah. Nyanjor, tinggal, tinggal, agak tu sedikit cuci. Siapa tu bisa mau? She's telling me that it sounds like a helicopter. 자꾸 그러죠. 뭐? 아주 스카트 좀 줄게요. 지. 양가죽 쪼라. 강 잠깐만 풀어서 사면 그렇지.
Tarak barak zara.
슈낭.
Shunan kang snya tarak barak zara.
어.
Shu kholang butcha khola to.
어.
Kang khola tarak barak.
따라서 냐뿌냐 보알.
Dayang hawa chesno ya.
소아.
Shu kholang yu to se.
라. 알라갈락 사다.
Parate khola to se. Parate la shu kholang yu to se. Sanskoni.
송.
Anach.
So here he is hearing two sounds simultaneously. One like a boiling water, boiling tea that everyone, most of them are hearing, and then they're also hearing some ice going with the flow with the water. So that sound is most like cracking sound, like with the boiling also, like something like that.
And quote from a colleague, Karine Gagne, who's an anthropologist who works in Ladakh. She writes, glaciers are known through different epistemic practices, and the detached and dispassionate scientific outlook on glaciers, which entails a rationalization that allows their conversion into spatial and geographic data, is only one way of knowing glaciers. What if we could see knowledge about glaciers as something that is not anchored in a technocratic imagination? What if glaciers were not considered merely as segregated ice summits, but rather as embedded in a living mountain environment, home to humans and other beings? And I'm going to play just one little audio clip where I end, and just move ahead to. I wanted to. Our project is called. So excuse me. I just wanted to So Karine Gagne's point is really crucial for me, and this is Faiza and I, along with Jigmit, and worked with Marup Namgayal, who's a song collector. And he's been collecting, as it says, folk songs about mountains, glaciers, rivers, streams, etc. And we worked with Farooq to transcribe and produce a book, because that's what he really said he really needed, was a book that he could use in workshops. And then the song book has been used, and there's been throughout Ladakh, and it's in all of the schools as well. And Marup has been running workshops, and the workshops continue in different ways. So this was also, listening also needed to be understood not just as like technical modes of listening, but also hearing intergenerational kinds of stories, and really asking the question, where does environmental knowledge reside? Of course it resides in other things like poems and folk songs. Sorry, that's just a bit of a short clip. And I wanted to end with, give the last word, so to speak, to Nishant Tikkun, who's an environmentalist, and he works on this project, the Ice Stupa project, to grow artificial glaciers as a way of capturing, producing water reserves, etc. And it was an interview that we had at the sort of environmental school that he actually runs, and I'll just play that clip and then end it there. Our project is called Listening to Ice. Do you have any experiences of sound and glaciers that are important for you?
Sound as in acoustic, physical. Yeah, ice talks a lot. We've seen that in Ice Stupa. If you stand inside enough Ice Stupa, during the day, it will have, sun is there, becoming a crack. You can hear it. You can hear when you're walking on ice. During the night, when it's melting, The water is sprinkling up and falling and instantly becoming ice right there. You can hear it. Yes, it's a very interactive. Ice, water, I mean, these kind of things, they are more like living. They communicate. It is up to you if you can reply back, basically, or if you can hear and understand. Yeah, that's true.
Great. So I'm going to leave it there. So thank you.